on this computer. Thank you. All right. So I'm introducing today Amber Fitzgerald from UC Davis Health. Thank you so much for being here, Amber. And today we are going to talk about understanding autism, diagnosis, supports, and services. Just in time we barely made it for the cutoff of Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Amber, for giving us your time today.
Sure, of course. Thanks for having me. So welcome, everyone. As was mentioned, I am from UC Davis Mind Institute, the Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities. And my background is really in working in education and with families who have children who are neurodiverse. And so it's really nice for me to be able to come and share some information with you about autism specifically, in the hopes that I can give you some broad information about it, diagnosis, and then the services and support. So we will do questions at the end. So definitely, if you think about them, even while I'm talking in the beginning, pop them into chat so you don't forget. That would be really great. And then I will be sharing a version of this presentation through a PDF. And then there also are a couple of resources I share with you as well. And I'll make sure that those are available to you afterwards as well. So I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. All right, does that look okay to everyone? Perfect. Okay, and the other thing, I feel like acronym and titles and everything in special education and services, we are inundated with them, but my master's degree is in special education, and BCBA, for those of you that those are kind of some new letters, it stands for Board Certified Behavior Analyst, which means I've taken some graduate coursework and I've become certified specifically in kind of looking at behavior and behavior analysis and behavior support. So that's just what that means. I'm also, like I mentioned, a credentialed teacher, and I do work at the Mind Institute as a trainer and clinician in a couple different projects. One of those being the CEDD, so the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So the goal today is to think about, when we might have a kiddo and we have some initial concerns, how to pay attention to those, and really most importantly, how to communicate with providers to get the support that you might need as a family member. I'll go over briefly autism, talk about what's involved in a medical diagnosis. Then we're going to talk briefly about some intervention supports and services that you might be interacting with as a caregiver and parent. Today's presentation is meant to be a broad overview, right? We could spend a lot of time on each one of these topics specifically. So in an hour, this is really broad information, and hopefully to share some resources with you where you can get more specific, detailed information. And I also know through the Family Resource Center, there's a lot of more specific information too, if you have one specific question related to a process, but broad information here to kind of get you started in thinking about some of these pieces. So what is autism? So autism is autism spectrum disorder. It is a developmental disability. So it's caused by differences in the brain. So there are biological differences within our brain. Individuals with autism might behave or communicate differently, interact differently, and most importantly, often learn in different ways from other people. So those brain-based differences really impact a couple different areas of an individual's life. Also, I just wanted to say, as I'm getting started, I tend to use mostly individual or people first language, like individuals with autism, throughout my training and presentation. But I also want to state that there is a lot of discussion and movement in our field in general of listening to adult advocates who have shared that there are a lot of individuals, adults with autism, that prefer to have autistic first and be called an autistic man. So just want you to know there's kind of differing thoughts within the field. And so for this training and purposes, I'm going to move forward with people first language, but just want to acknowledge that there is different thoughts and beliefs about that. And I want to respect those as well. Actually, a lot of great conversation and research in our field when we are having the ability to work with people who are neurodiverse, who can share their personal experiences and perspectives really to better inform our practices. So I feel like we're only getting better with the information we're receiving. So autism. So people with autism may also have different ways of learning, moving, or paying attention. So it can affect different parts of an individual's life. And it is a spectrum. So it means all individuals that have a diagnosis with autism are affected differently. There's a saying out there that if you know one person with autism, you really only know one person with autism. So you might know folks in your life or have met or seen a TV character and you think one way about autism, but just know all individuals are impacted differently who have this diagnosis. And there is a lot of variability within that. So I wanted to start out with this video initially because there's a couple parents this was part of a study called Mind the Gap. I actually have some resources about that as well that we put together, but a couple of parents shared kind of their experiences, and just, this is a beginning snippet. It's a 22-minute video. I'm only showing you about 2 minutes or so of 3 parents talking about their kiddo with autism. And I want you just to pay attention to kind of all how they describe their child and the differences. I think they do a great job representing how variable autism can be and the perspectives of a parent. So I'm going to get us started here. You know what? I want to make sure I shared my audio. Here we go. Even though I told myself to do that, I still forgot. Okay, so I'm going to start us
with 14 and 6'8".
I'm going to back us up and start right when the
questions as we go.
Here we go.
My son, Christopher, is 14, 14 and 6'8", so you can imagine what that looks like. My favorite thing to do with him is to go shopping. He likes to shop in the grocery stores, at Target, at Walmart. And I think he likes it because it gives him a sense of independency to be able to shop and put in there what he wants and what have you. And also he was diagnosed with autism at 2.5. So that was the beginning of our journey with him.
Cameron is Cameron, a wonderful, beautiful, bright individual who has so much potential. I don't want someone to just say autism and that's it. There's so much more behind a child. They just need support. And when I think about it, we all have special needs. Some people, don't want to be touched. Some people, need a lot of hugs. Some people maybe don't socialize. Maybe they're more introverted. Some are more extroverted, but we all have special needs. And so I try to kind of think of it like that. We all need something. We all are just trying to get our needs met in a way that's appropriate. So helping my son navigate this world, and as adults it's confusing for us. We're just trying to navigate it. So it can be scary, as with any big life experience, graduating high school, getting your driving permit, getting married, maybe someone passing away. All of that's scary, but you don't let it define you, and you work through it, and you have to accept your new normal for whatever that is for you. Did I like the diagnosis? No. Are we coping? Yeah. There's help. It's not always easy, but life never is.
Well, I have 5 kids, and the second to the youngest was diagnosed with autism. Since he was my 4th, I just noticed little quirks before 6 months. He would make eye contact, but it just didn't seem like he was maybe understanding. He would give a blank stare. And it was hard for me to convince everyone else, because when they would see him, they would just be playing and saying, well, he's making eye contact. That's number one thing that they say, the myths about autism. And so I just noticed things at an early age, but it was convincing everyone else, like the doctors, because they were saying, well, he doesn't fit the normal standards for it. And I said, well, every kid is different. So it was a long journey since 6 months, and he's 5 years old now.
We know you are here because you want what is best for your child.
Okay, so like I said, that's just a snippet, but this is a video called What is Autism that we put together as part of a program called Mind the Gap at UC Davis, and I will be sharing links there's a full online resource binder that you can access that has some of the resources I'm going to be sharing as well. So I like sharing this clip about from the family sharing their perspective and experiences, because I feel like it really does a nice job of just representing different parents' thoughts and perspectives and things to pay attention to, and just how different their experiences are as well. So I mentioned autism spectrum disorder is biologically based. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It does occur equally across cultures and socioeconomic statuses. We right now, practitioners can detect autism reliably about 12 to 18 months. So this means some younger children who've been diagnosed around 12 to 18 months, being tested or assessed again around age 3 is consistent with the diagnosis of autism. So there's been really an improvement in the ability to diagnose autism earlier. Still, the average or typical diagnosis is around 4 years of age. So we're trying really hard to work with primary care physicians and providers to really work to get some earlier diagnosis if we can, so families, caregivers, and individuals can get the support they need a little bit earlier to learn some additional skills. So we know that, when we have children who are typically developing or develop along a continuum as expected, there are general milestones, if you will, that children reach and how they play, how they learn, how they talk, what their behaviors look like. And because autism is a developmental disability, that means children with autism might develop differently, right, in different areas of the developmental stages. So one of the biggest things that parents often ask me, or parents are kind of trying to figure out, is like, how do I know what's typical, especially if you have this is your first child, or there's been a big gap in between the ages of your children, or perhaps you haven't been around a lot of younger children. It's often hard to know kind of what is quote unquote typical. So then we know kind of what is of concern. So the Centers for Disease Control, so CDC, has a really lovely milestone tracker app. You can just search on any Android or phone under milestone tracker. It's completely free. And you can kind of take a look at what are, based on the age of your child, it will pop up kind of what are the typical milestones. Also, it's really great because you can track those milestones, and then it gives you some tips and activities as well. So parents in general, whether you have a concern about development or not, this is a really great resource for our families. And really user-friendly. So I definitely, if you aren't already familiar with this, I encourage you to take a look at it because it is really informative and helpful. They also have a lot of great resources specific to the Learn the Signs Act Early initiative, also through the CDC. So this is really helping to inform parents on what the early signs are of maybe differences in development, so you can act early. So this is a great handout. This is one of the links I will give you at the end. After the training you'll receive from me, but it's kind of how to talk to your doctor. So there's a step-by-step process in this handout if you're concerned about development, of how to have a conversation with your doctor, making an appointment, completing the milestone checklist, what to say during the appointment. So a lot of times parents are overwhelmed with the process, how to get started, or just how to communicate general concerns. So there's some really great handouts that they've put together to support parents, caregivers, family members, in having these conversations with providers. So really, when we think about autism and being concerned, if you're a family member, monitoring development, paying attention to those critical milestones is really an important piece of this. So that means we've kind of got to monitor development, and the best person to do that is parents, caregivers. So you are with your child more than anybody else, and it's really, you're in the best position to kind of take a look at things to see how well they're going. And then ideally share your thoughts using the milestone checklist, or just, talking through it with your child's teacher, if they're in a daycare, preschool, or school age setting, or other providers that you might be working with or supporting, and with your doctor at a well child visit, or you can schedule a visit that's not a well child visit just to have a conversation with your doctor. So if you're concerned, you kind of, if you log on to that milestone tracker, or you access that information and you're concerned about developmental milestones, you know, it's great to reach out to your doctor and ask for a developmental screening. So developmental screenings are really important, not just when we're thinking about autism, but in general, helping parents and providers work together to identify kind of where are the gaps in development and what is available to you to get started to receive services and some additional support. So this is another resource. I'm going to share it with you after I kind of highlight some of the differences we think about developmentally for autism. It's called the Autism Navigator resource. It's completely free as well. They have a really great structure to their videos. If you haven't ever seen this, they show what would be considered a typical developmental age, and then in a same activity, and then they'll show you a kiddo who is exhibiting what would be called red flags, and they're called red flags just means like we should pay attention to them. That development might be a little bit different than expected. And so they're normally like 30-second, 40-second clips. So you as a caregiver or provider can take a look at it and kind of see what each of those areas of autism looks like if it's developing differently. So I'm going to show that to you in just a little bit to give you an idea about that resource. It's a really lovely resource. I mentioned if you're concerned, contact your child's doctor to have a question with them. It's important to know the people who can provide a medical diagnosis would be specialists who do really an in-depth evaluation. So the first step would be with your pediatrician, preferably talking through concerns, maybe completing that screening, and then really advocating for a referral to a specialist. So developmental behavioral pediatricians or developmental pediatricians have specific training in the development of children with special needs and can provide a diagnosis, as well as child neurologists and child psychologists or psychiatrists. So there's a couple different professionals that can actually complete the comprehensive assessment and provide the diagnosis. There's also some additional resources if you're not quite sure how to request an evaluation for early childhood. There is a process called Child Find where you're able to connect with local early intervention service systems to get some additional support as well. So there is a early childhood technical assistance center that has a number that can help you get connected as well. But I also know you're obviously connected with the Family Focus Resource Center, and you can get a lot of this information from them as well to help you kind of identify where to get started in the system. So let's say you've noticed some concerns about development, you've kind of checked out the milestone tracker or had conversations about kind of where there might be some gaps in development for your child, and you've talked with your pediatrician and gotten a referral. So the next thing is kind of what does diagnosis really look like for autism? What are these providers really paying attention to for diagnosis of autism? I really think as parents, family members, it's super important for us to be knowledgeable and to ask questions if we don't understand. You might be talking and working with a lot of folks who have a high level of expertise in diagnosis or autism, and sometimes they forget that some of us might not. And so I always tell caregivers it's so important to pause conversations, ask clarifying questions, ask clinicians to slow down or to repeat information, to give you things to read ahead of time. It's okay for you to let the person you're working with know kind of the best way that you learn and you process information. So I just wanted to say that because this process can be really overwhelming, and it's important that you understand it, and we need to ask questions in order to understand that. So diagnosing autism can be a little bit difficult since there is no medical test. So there's no scan or blood test, genetic tests that can confirm a diagnosis of autism. Autism is diagnosed through comprehensive observations of the child, looking at a history of development, observing the child in specific situations, interviewing family members and providers about kind of the kiddo and what they're demonstrating. I mentioned it can be detected as 12 to 18 months. So some people aren't diagnosed until later, especially, unfortunately, girls are often diagnosed later than boys. Just they believe the current research is based on how autism presents and how it looks in girls. And also, as a society, we have some like preconceived norms or ideas about what individuals in different genders might act or be like. And so oftentimes, autism with young girls can be overlooked. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about developmental milestones and thinking about kind of concerns that you might have. I also want to say it's okay as a parent if you have a concern. One of the moms in the video I showed really spoke about this briefly, but it was super important how at 6 months she was noticing some things and talked to the doctor, and the doctor said, oh no, I'm sure it's fine. It's okay to be persistent and advocate for your child. You're really going to be the main person who's going to have the strongest voice to do that. So while there are experts who are knowledgeable and we can respect their expertise, it is okay to communicate and advocate and express concerns and really kind of continue conversations, as opposed to just kind of being told, you know, oh, it's fine, or I'm sure she'll start talking soon, or she might just be quiet, or he's just a boy. All of those types of statements, we'd like to believe that's happening less and less often with education for those who diagnose, but we know as parents still need to have that voice and express those concerns. So when the clinician does a diagnosis of autism, they're looking at specific kind of patterns of behavior or traits, if you will. So autism is diagnosed when there is indication that there's differences in social communication and social interaction, and the presence of what's called restrictive, intense, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but the acronym for that is RRBs. So the other thing about diagnosis, it's important to know, I mentioned earlier, is autism is a spectrum, which means you're going to have kiddos who demonstrate more signs and symptoms of autism, and others who demonstrate less, kiddos who might need more support in different areas, and those that might mean less. That doesn't mean if they meet certain criteria, they don't have autism. It just means the intensity and the demonstration of those traits might look a little bit different. So there's 3 levels that's identified. This is all part of diagnosis. So if your child's going through diagnosis or has been diagnosed, you should be told by your clinician which level of autism they feel like your child is currently at. So level 1 requires some supports, 2 is substantial supports, and 3 is very substantial supports. And that's how the diagnostic manuals, this comes straight from the manual that kind of outlines how to diagnose autism for clinicians. So I'm going to break these 2 areas down for you just to kind of give you an idea. I also want to say we all have variability in our own lives in each of these categories, like how we communicate, even our repetitive behaviors like tapping our foot, tapping our fingers, twirling a pencil when we're listening. You all might be doing something right now listening to me. So one of these characteristics does not mean an individual has autism. Even a couple of them doesn't mean that. The clinician looks at what it looks like all together. So I just want to make sure that folks hear that. Sometimes when we do these types of trainings or overviews, immediately people think, you know, oh, my kiddo does that one thing, they must have autism. In fact, it's really looking at all of these characteristics together, seeing them kind of within the child, and then taking a look at how that impacts the child's like behavior and communication with others and social. So just know this is multiple things coming together for a diagnosis of autism. So one of them is within the social communication domain is the diagnostic criteria is differences in social emotional reciprocity. So reciprocity is that give and take, the back and forth between one person and another. So when I have a social interaction or an exchange, it requires another person to kind of respond to me, either with a word or a smile or a comment or a question. That's the social piece, it requiring another human to kind of be my partner in that social interaction. So oftentimes individuals with autism might have a reduced social approach, so might not initiate social interactions as readily. There could be difficulty with a back and forth conversation. Also, maybe a limited interest in like sharing a toy or sharing about what happened, or kind of an interest. And also, individuals with autism can be less responsive to social interactions. So sometimes if I smile and a kiddo might smile back to me or clap or kind of look in my direction with a kiddo with autism, you might see a difference in how they respond to those social interactions. Also, there's a difference in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction. So this means kind of how do we use our facial expressions, our gestures, our hand movements, all of that verbal, so spoken, and nonverbal, facial, gestural, to communicate with others. There can be difficulty with eye contact, but that's not always the case. It's just one of the pieces to look at for autism. Also, using bodies to communicate, body language to communicate, can be reduced as well. There can be a difficulty in understanding and using nonverbal. So understanding if I point, that a point means to look in the direction that I'm pointing or that I'm getting your attention, that might be difficult to understand. And also difficulty with facial expressions or gestures. So processing what those mean in a social interaction. If I smile, might mean I'm happy. If I look scared, what that might mean. So there is this difference in understanding of those verbal and nonverbal cues as well. The other element of social communication that's part of diagnosis is a difference in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So this is about a couple things. So our ability to understand and adjust our behaviors to different social settings. So how I interact with my friends at dinner is, and conversations I have and how I talk is going to look different than probably when I'm home with my 3 boys, or if I'm at a work meeting or at a conference, right? Those types of how I maybe even stand or what I wear, how I talk to people, the language that I use, all of that, we learn to adjust that based on our social situation. And that can be something that's difficult for individuals with autism to learn naturally just through experience. Oftentimes individuals with autism, we need to spend more time explaining kind of those differences and, you know, why we might act differently with different people, why we might say things differently to different people as well. The other piece that this comes out is kind of this imaginative play and making friends in younger children. So sometimes that can be a little bit difficult, sharing in play, wanting to share something with another child because they're excited about it, or having an imaginative idea about a toy can also look different with individuals with autism. So those are kind of the areas when we think about social communication. So you can tell it covers a lot of different specific skills within that category itself. And the second big area I mentioned is restrictive repetitive behavior. So oftentimes some folks who know a little bit about autism know about the repetitive motor movements. So it could be moving our hands or fingers or twirling something. So these are considered simple motor repetitive behaviors. Also things like lining up toys, flipping objects over and over again. So anything kind of done in repetition. Or echolalia is repeating back what they hear another person saying. So sometimes it can be repetitively repeating back words or sayings or phrases. But restrictive and repetitive behavior can also be needing things to say the same every time. So having a rigid response to change. So maybe eating the food in the same order or putting it in exactly where it's supposed to be on the plate. Having food sorted a certain way on the plate could be a restrictive repetitive behavior. You can see in this picture lining up duckies or toys, right, in a specific order, or lining up toys repeatedly could also be considered a restrictive repetitive behavior. But I want to say the difference is we all have the need for, at differing degrees. Some would say I have a high degree of wanting things organized. So there might be elements of our life you're thinking, well, I line things up, or I like things in a certain way, or I put my clothes away a certain way, or we put the dishes away a certain way. I want to load the dishwasher a specific way. Really, the difference when we're thinking about autism is how restrictive the behavior becomes. So if a child or an individual has the need for repetition and is really rigid in thinking about that, that means any change to that routine can be really distressful, might cause an increase in the child expressing discomfort with it, like crying or a tantrum. So it's not just the idea that things are organized or lined up in a certain way. It's really the impact that takes on our day-to-day life and our routines and how flexible we are or how rigid we are. Also, we can see this if kiddos have difficulty with transition. So transitioning from one activity to another can often be hard for individuals with autism, especially if it's expected, but not wanting to leave an activity before moving on to another one, having really rigid thinking patterns about specific rules or ideas and needing to follow through with them. Also, greeting rituals. You might see this if an individual needs to greet folks a certain way or do it repeatedly over and over, and then they want the person to have the same response back to them. So these are all just different examples of what this type of restrictive repetitive behavior could look like. Really wanting the sameness, being inflexible, and having some really specific rituals related to behavior. And another element of this category might look like a child being hyper, so ultra sensitive and reactive to sensory, or under reactive, so hypo. It could be a heightened sensitivity to pain or temperature, so feeling things more intensely than others, or adverse responses to sounds or textures, so not liking certain sounds, from crinkling of bag to trucks outside, sounds that you might not even hear but they're hearing it, can dysregulate or cause them some stress. Also, smelling and touching objects can be an example of this, needing to do that with every object that is picked up or explored. Also, this can be a child having an interest, a visual interest in lights or movement. So really liking what lights look like and having things in front of their eyes that they want to look at repeatedly. So these are, like I said, examples, but just bringing up the different elements that are required for diagnosis. So you can see it's pretty complex, right? There's a lot of things to consider. It's not one of these traits. It's multiple traits and symptoms that's observed and it's assessed happening together. So that's kind of one thing I just wanted to plant the seed. So you're thinking about this. Remember, it's not all of this. It's not all of this. Or it's not one thing, it's multitude of these together. And that's the clinician's job, to look at the diagnostic criteria and to really explain that to you. So I'm going to just show you a quick video, a couple of examples, because I think this is a really great resource and also really informative. So this is from the Autism Navigator. So I just walked you through pretty quickly the different categories for autism diagnosis. And if you remember, I talked about the social emotional reciprocity. So that interaction between somebody else and the child. So this first video I'm going to show you is a little guy who's only 15 months old, and it's a bubble game. And I want you to pay attention to kind of how he listens. There's a trainer therapist in the corner that you don't really see on camera. How he responds to his mom, the therapist, and then interacts with the bubbles with his mom. So I'm going to play that right now.
Pop. Hello. Oh! No way. One more? they're for you. Bubbles. Bubbles. Let Mama open. You give it to Mama? Give it to Mama. Yeah. You want me to blow bubbles? Yeah. Bubbles?
So in that quick clip, you can see there's a lot of shared enjoyment with the bubbles with mom. There's some verbalization of making a sound. He followed the therapist's point when she pointed to mom and said, show it to mom. He looked at the therapist and then he looked in mom's direction too, and wanted to share in that activity. So those are all little characteristics, but important to pay attention to when we think about the social emotional reciprocity. So this next video is a little kiddo, he's 17, same bubble activity, and let's take a look at what it might look like if he hasn't developed quite the same level of social emotional reciprocity.
Uh-oh, only got one. You got it. You got it. There's the bubbles. There's the bubbles. Do you want more? Do you want more bubbles? Ethan. You want more? Can you give him? Ethan. He says if I keep rolling them, maybe somebody will take them. Can you give him to Mama?
Give it to me, sweetie. Give it to me.
Let's give him to Mama. Give him to Mama. Thank you. Yeah, if you want to open them. I'll blow them if you want me to. It's up to you. You blow.
Okay, so in that example, you can see Ethan, is this little boy's name, has more focus on the bubbles itself. So he's more object focused than he is focused on his mom. Also, when they mentioned his name multiple times, he didn't respond or look up when they called his name, and he really was just interested in rolling it and knocking it over. And it didn't look at his mom to reference the activity at all. So one example where you can see what is considered more of a typical development and when social emotional reciprocity is delayed in that interaction. I'm going to show you one more. So this is an example in the repetitive patterns, behaviors, and restrictive interests, specifically the ritualized patterns of behavior. So really looking at this one specifically. What I love too about Autism Navigator, just to let you know, is they do a really great job explaining in more detail, kind of going into more detail than what I've covered, and then providing you with these examples as well, which I think is really helpful when you're trying to process what typical development looks like and what might be some concerns when you're thinking about autism. So Jimmy is 15 months. We'll see his interaction with hugging and feeding Big Bird with the bottle here.
You want to feed the birdie? Can you feed the birdie? I'm hungry. Hungry. Uh-oh. You want to give him a hug? Oh, sweet boy. Give him a hug. I have big baby. For me? Oh, for Big Bird. He likes that. Thank you. That's yummy. More. Oh, some for Mom too. Making some breakfast. Some eggs. Yeah, he likes eggs. Eggs. Yeah. Stir up the eggs. Is it hot? Is it hot? Is it hot, sweetie? Oh, hot. Hot. Oh, you're pouring it in. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Is the food in there now? I think it is. Oh, blow it. It's hot. It's hot.
So in that, I'm going to pause it there. You can get an idea. He's having imaginative play with Big Bird, with his mom, with the therapist. He's imitating several different types of actions with the bottle, with the cooking, stirring, pouring. So that is looking at more of a typical pattern of behavior in this play activity. So next is Jason, and let's kind of look at how he plays, if you see any make-believe play, and how he interacts with the objects.
With the spoon?
Big Bird's hungry.
Or something with the spoon?
Let's do a few minutes of this and then let's try it with the passy and see if
Okay.
he'll feed Big Bird then with the passy.
Oh, you put it all in the bowl. Are you cleaning? Are you cleaning up?
Big Bird's hungry. Big Bird's hungry. You can feed Big Bird? Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
So in that really quick clip, you can see that Jason's more intent on the objects themselves, collecting them, putting them in order, really not in a functional way. So putting them in a bowl, trying to hold them all even in his arms, and then he drops them. So doing this type of activity might function as a way to give him some calm, or he's working to create order in his environment. But in that clip, you can see just the difference of what that can look like with a young kiddo. So great resources to check out. Like I said, there's a lot more. They've done a really great job. It's completely free for you to access, and I'll have the links of those afterwards that you can share as well. Diana, I saw your videos on. Did you have a question for me, or is it okay for me to keep going?
No, you can go ahead and keep going if you'd like, unless there are questions right now that people want to do, or you want to hold off until you're finished.
Either way, I'm fine with. We can pause and see if folks have any questions before I kind of briefly go over the supports and services.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so we're gonna continue on right there. Right now, there's no questions, but go ahead and continue on.
Okay, great. Thank you. So when you go through diagnosis with a provider, it's important that you receive a formal evaluation. The evaluation should highlight your child's strengths and the areas that they feel like can be supported through some instruction and teaching, whether they meet the criteria or not for a specific diagnosis. So your evaluation and report should have that information for you, and it should be gone over by your provider. So one thing to know, if you receive a medical diagnosis of autism, it might help you access services in two ways. Regional centers. So regional centers in California provide services to families. And I'm going to go over that a little bit in more detail about the eligibility for regional center services, and also your private healthcare provider and insurance. So just keep in mind, a diagnosis oftentimes can open doors that otherwise wouldn't be open for services that require a specific diagnosis. Also, the medical diagnosis should be considered if your child is school age. So in California, that starts at age 3, where school districts are responsible for education if a child does have a disability or developmental delay. But a medical diagnosis does not immediately guarantee school services or supports, but it should be used to help your educational team identify the supports that are needed for your child. And I'm going to talk a little bit about accessing services in school as well. So once a child becomes identified or diagnosed with autism, it's important to think about kind of what's next. Well, the goal is to get some additional supports and services to help teach those skills that might not be developing at a typical rate. And it's really important for us to use what are called EBPs, which stands for, and I apologize, I thought it was spelled out on here, so I'm going to fix that, but evidence-based practices. So evidence-based practices means, strategies that research has shown to be effective with children with autism. So those strategies that are used by providers or teachers should really be selected based on the unique needs of the child, the family, and the staff's ability to implement that. So I have a handout at the end that's for families. It was developed by Captain Network, which is a statewide network here in California, as a handout to help families better understand what evidence-based practices are. So if you have a younger child, early intervention services are age birth to 3, and it's really important to get connected with early intervention services when you feel like your child might have a developmental delay or receives a diagnosis. So both can be true. You can receive early intervention services and support if there's just some general developmental delay concerns as well. And research has shown us that the earlier we work with and support young children, we can really support with increased development in specific areas. So a lot of folks don't know what natural or what early intervention is. So early intervention is intended to support, like I said, families of children birth to 3. Early intervention should happen in a natural setting. So either in the family's home or a space that the family feels comfortable in, like a park. There are some early intervention services that are offered at centers or organizations if families feel more comfortable not having individuals in their home, but it is most commonly offered within the home environment of the child. It should be family centered. So as a caregiver, you should be front and center with your child of helping to set goals and really share ideas about what kind of supports are needed. Family members, caregivers are the critical piece of early intervention. So early intervention providers will often come in the home and share strategies and ideas with the idea that the parent family members are going to be delivering that strategy throughout each day, throughout the week, and the provider comes to check in on them. So just remember the time your child has with you is really important, and really you should be getting support and strategies to help you work on some specific things with your child. So children in California qualify for earlier intervention. If there's developmental delays, you can see them listed here. I'm not going to read through each of them. So there's quite a few, from physical to communication to autism spectrum, general to social emotional development. So you can qualify with developmental delays in California for early intervention. And it targets several different things. It can work on like gross motor, walking, jumping, climbing, balancing. It can work on some cognitive skills. So learning basic object names or colors, or really kind of building kind of those thinking skills in a young kiddo. It also can work on communication. So being able to communicate with words or with an alternate method like pictures or a device, but also understanding nonverbal cues as well. It can be social and emotionally based, and also work with like self-help skills like zipping or putting your arm in a jacket, learning how to start brushing your teeth, maybe some really basic pulling your legs into a pant, that type of thing for self-help skills. So early intervention can work on a variety of different skills, and it should really be based on the needs of your child. There's quite a few professionals that work with children with developmental disabilities in early intervention, from teachers to psychologists, maybe social workers. There's service coordinators, speech and language therapists can help with that communication development. Occupational therapists, physical therapists work on fine and gross motor skills. You might be getting support, or your child might be appropriate to get support from behavior support providers. So you can see there's a multitude of individuals that a family might work with in early intervention. But ultimately, what I always like to share with families is just remember you are the expert on your child, period, end of discussion. So you should always be a critical piece of the discussion around supports and services, and communication is really what connects everyone together to ensure the child's getting the supports that they need. Early intervention has a process, right? So you just don't magically get a diagnosis or have a concern and start receiving services. Usually it follows this process. There's identification, either from your physician or a school provider, a referral's made to an early start agency, and then they complete an evaluation and write a report with you to determine the child's strengths and the areas they'd like to focus on. And then they develop a plan to support you in working with your child within the home environment. There are a lot of terms involved in service navigation and understanding services. IFSP is one of them. That stands for the Individual Family Service Plan. I'm not going into a ton of detail on that. I do have a handout I can share with you, but this really is the plan that you work with your early intervention agency coordinator to develop what goals you want to work on, what additional services will be provided. It also, this handout I'm going to share with you has a really great overview of what you can expect in a meeting, what your role is in a meeting, questions that you can ask. So it's really meant to be a family planning meeting where you work together to set the goals and how those goals are going to be worked on with your child, with the ultimate goal that we are going to increase and improve some of those delays in development and give parents and families the tools that they need to be successful to do that. If your child has a developmental disability or diagnosis and at the age of 3, their services will start to be provided by the school system that you're involved in. So our public school system, there's a transition from age 3 at the time of age 3 from early intervention into school systems in the state of California. So special education is a set of services that is offered to individuals who have a specific diagnosis and show that they need some extra support in school to be successful. So special education, just like early intervention services, are provided at no cost to the family. And they're intended to provide the best quality of education for your student. So I mentioned the child needs to meet educational eligibility for special education. So a diagnosis of autism is one of the categories that is supported. So the diagnosis or eligibility of autism alone doesn't qualify a kiddo. They also then need to show that they need additional supports and services as a result of the autism to be successful in school. So special education can target most of the same skills you saw in early intervention. So skills across an individual's life that would be really important for long-term independence and success. There are 13 different eligibility categories under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is IDEA, which is a federal law that mandates free and appropriate education to individuals diagnosed with a disability and have one of these 13, might be in one of these 13 eligibility categories. And you can see autism as one of them and the other ones as well. So special education, I briefly mentioned this before, is determined based on eligibility. A medical diagnosis alone does not mean a child will get special education services. I work with a lot of parents, and this is often a big question that they have and a misunderstanding. So medical diagnosis allows you to get access to a lot of different services with your insurance and early intervention, maybe regional center, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But for educational services, the team at your child's school district would need to do an assessment and make a determination if your child qualifies and would fall under one of those 13 categories, like I said, and also demonstrate a need for additional supports. Special education also has a set of processes to get started, and this is where some things can be just really overwhelming. So I always tell parents just to walk through it one step at a time. First, an individual needs to be identified. So someone needs to refer. They can come from early intervention into school age. Like I mentioned, the team evaluates the child, does an assessment to determine if they're eligible. Instead of an IFSP, there is an IEP in education. So it stands for an individualized education plan. So that plan is intended to identify, just like the IFSP, the child's current skills, their strengths, and their areas for need, specific goals that the team will work on, and then what services does the child need to meet those goals? So do they need speech and language support at the school? Do they need occupational therapy to help them with their writing? So lots of things to consider when you're thinking about the special education process. So for identification, school personnel, so if your child is transitioning from early intervention into school age, it will be part of the process that they will be getting an assessment with your school. You have to make sure that that happens, that transition happens. But let's say your child is already school age and hasn't ever had any services. So a school provider, teacher can request an evaluation, but you can as well as a parent. So parents can request an evaluation if you have concerns, and you should submit that in writing to the school, indicating your concerns, why you would want the assessment. The second step is the evaluation. I mentioned what it's determining, the educational need, the eligibility, and what exactly supports should be provided. The purpose of the IEP is to really set those goals and be super clear about the services the school is agreeing to provide to support your child's growth and development to meet those goals. There are a lot of terms in service navigation. I know I've already mentioned that. I think it's unfortunate. I think a lot of terms and acronyms are used, and sometimes caregivers, and myself included, all hear new acronyms, and I'm always like, wait, can you guys explain to me what I know you probably think I should know, but I don't know. So it's really important for you to ask if you don't understand, and for folks to indicate kind of what an acronym means and really take some time explaining it. So the IEP is one of those terms. It is a legal document. The school is mandated to provide the supports as it's written once you sign it and agree to it. You don't have to agree to everything that's said on the IEP in the beginning without any input. Remember, you are a member of your child's IEP team, and actually you're the only member of the team that will be with on the child's team throughout their whole educational career. So your role is very important. So you should be involved in the conversation. It should be a partnership in developing the IEP, and it should kind of be sharing and receiving information that's bi-directional. So you hearing from the providers and them hearing from you as well. There's lots of different services that can be written into an IEP at the school level. It is truly based on the needs of a child. So it could be behavior, it could be testing modifications, it could be adaptive physical education, which is a teacher that comes and works on those gross motor skills and some of those like full body activities to support and development. So there's a lot of different things that can be included in the IEP. And I know I've mentioned the other part of the service delivery system is regional centers. So regional centers are across the state of California in specific regions. They provide services to children that are eligible 3 years and older. The criteria for eligibility based on the law that supports, which is the Lanterman Act, the services are medical diagnosis of autism, intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, or another similar intellectual disability, plus a difficulty of the individual has to have impairment in 3 or more of these areas. So once again, diagnosis alone doesn't qualify, but a demonstrated delay in one of these 3 areas that are considered functional, really important skills needs to be present. And then the services should be aimed at looking at maximizing the individual's potential. And for adults, it's supporting them more in community living and increasing their independence. One thing to know for children aged 3 to 5, regional center services can be eligible even if you don't have, this is fairly new in the last couple of years, a diagnosis. It can be determined that you qualify for regional center services if your child's demonstrating a developmental delay and does not yet have a diagnosis, and then they can be reassessed again before they turn 5. So often kiddos being served with regional center services might show some delays in self-care, maybe mobility, so walking around, language, communication. They need a delay in 2 or more areas of the developmental areas listed here. This was actually great news. A lot of families were waiting for diagnosis and assessment, weren't getting any services. The regional center now is able to work with families as you kind of pursue diagnosis, or you figure out what's generally, what supports you might need for your child. There are common regional center services. There's other services. This is not a complete list, but respite is respite care, providing care within the home or someone to come within the home to provide an opportunity for caregivers to have a break or to do some other things around the house as needed. So it's supervision and care of the child. They can fund respite. They also provide parent training, some additional training around behavior and adaptive skills. And if needed, there are some residential services that are provided that you can work with your service coordinator. And then they do have adult services as well. One thing I will say in early intervention and regional center, you will always be connected to a service coordinator. So someone who's in charge of managing your case and facilitating the services and the discussions and helping you get what you need. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I just want you to know, because every health insurance is different, but a lot of families don't know the California Autism Health Insurance legislation. So it's SB 946. Provided an avenue for families to get some additional therapies that are considered to be autism specific. So this could be in-home support from providers or interventionists, as long as, you know, like anything with insurance, that provider is connected to your an approved provider through your insurance. You can get some financial help and assistance with some of those treatments as well. So just things to consider, to know about, and to ask about. Here's some additional information. This will be on the slides that are shared with you, but you know, obviously what's provided is different based on your insurance carrier. There's a lot of behavioral health services that are managed like through carve-out services. And I have to tell you, insurance is not my lane of high levels of expertise. I just know in some families I've supported, trying to navigate this process is a little bit tricky. You just need to keep advocating and asking what is approved, what is funded. If you have a child with autism and calling and asking what supports are approved, it is the responsibility of your insurance carrier to let you know what's included in your plan as well. Medi-Cal also supports behavioral health service as well. So if you have Medi-Cal, that's something to think about. Here's resources for you. Also will be in the handout I provide to give you information about California Children's Services, Covered California, a lot of different areas where you can find out how you might be able to access additional services. There's also IHSS, which is in-home support services. This can also help families with individuals with a diagnosis or developmental delay, and SSI. So there's a lot of things here which can be overwhelming. I'm only sharing this so you know there's resources available to you. And I know family resource centers are really lovely at helping parents navigate these really big, I feel like, processes. So more informational for you to know, it's out there and something that you can access. And the last thing I just want to highlight for you is, you know, I mentioned evidence-based practices before. Oftentimes it's hard to know as a parent what is an intervention or service that should be considered for your child. And so we really want to think about making sure we're talking about with our providers interventions that are based in research and that there's been a lot of documentation of them being effective. Remember, you are the expert in your child, so having that conversation with your providers is really important, and hearing what they have to say about the practices themselves. This is all directly from a handout from Captain, that it's a really great resource for you to use as well, an infographic, and then it has a lot of great links on the final pages of it as well, for you to get some additional information about places where you can find information about resources and where to go for one specific topic, let's say, if you're interested in that. And finally, the video I showed you was from Mind the Gap, which is an online resource that I can share with you. It is in English and in Spanish. There are lots of different activities for families and caregivers, single page handouts, resources, videos. This is just a sampling of the ones I thought were relevant to our talk today. Just little screenshots of them, but we have kind of how to talk to providers. How do you talk to your family about autism? What is this IEP? What do I do with it? What does it mean? How do I get connected with parent centers and so on? So there are a lot of great resources in that binder as well that I will make sure that you have the link to, so you can access those resources. So I think if there's questions, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that folks have.
I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, Amber.
Great.